You already know what they look like. Four brothers in a row, each one a head taller than the last, identical black outfits, identical scowls, the smallest one always the angriest. They break out of prison. They lose to a cowboy who draws faster than his own shadow, and by the last page, they are marched right back to their cell. For millions of people across Europe and beyond, that is the Dalton Gang. Funny, harmless, forever defeated. But those four brothers never existed, and the men they were based on were not funny at all. The real Daltons were a large family from the American frontier, some of them lawmen, one of them a hero. And their story does not end with a comedy escape. It ends on a single morning in a Kansas town, in an alley between two banks, with most of them lying dead in the dirt before the church bells finished ringing. So who were they really? And how did they end up as the most beloved outlaws in the history of comics? To understand that, we have to go back to a homestead in Kansas, decades before anyone ever drew a cartoon. The Daltons were not a gang before they were a family. James Lewis Dalton and his wife Adeline raised somewhere around 15 children on a series of hardscrabble farms in Missouri and Kansas, close to the edge of what was then called Indian Territory. This was the country just after the Civil War, land that had never fully calmed down. The violence of the war had drained into the soil and stayed there, and the region was still crossed by outlaws, whiskey runners, and men who had never learned to put their guns away. And here is a detail the cartoons could never have invented. Adeline Dalton was an aunt of the Youngers. The Youngers rode with Frank and Jesse James in the James Younger Gang, the most notorious outlaws in America at the time. So the Dalton children grew up as blood relatives of living legends, hearing those names spoken at their own kitchen table. That matters, because ambition in this story is not an accident. It runs in the family. Now, for all of that, most of the Dalton children became ordinary, law-abiding people. Farmers, wives, quiet lives. The gang was never the whole family. It was a handful of brothers out of many. And the first of those brothers to make a name for himself did it wearing a badge, not hiding from one. His name was Frank. Frank Dalton was the eldest of the brothers who mattered to this story, and by every surviving account, he was the best of them. In 1884, he was commissioned as a Deputy United States Marshal, riding for the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas. That court was run by Judge Isaac Parker, remembered by history as the hanging judge, and the men who rode for him did some of the most dangerous police work in the country. They went alone into Indian Territory to arrest horse thieves, killers, and the whiskey runners who sold illegal liquor across the line. Frank was good at it, steady, respected, the kind of man other lawmen spoke well of. His younger brothers looked up to him. Grat, in particular, idolized him. Then, on the 27th of November, 1887, Frank rode out with another deputy to arrest a group of bootleggers camped across the river. As they approached, the men opened fire. Frank killed two of them before his gun jammed, and in that pause, with his weapon useless in his hands, one of the surviving outlaws shot him dead. His fellow deputy, wounded, left him where he fell. Frank Dalton was buried in Coffeyville, Kansas. Remember that name? The town will come back. Here is where the story turns, and it turns on grief and on money. After Frank was killed, two of his younger brothers stepped into his boots. Grat and Bob Dalton pinned on the same federal badge and began riding as deputy marshals themselves, working out of Fort Smith and Wichita. They hired their youngest brother Emmett to guard prisoners and ride along on posies. For a short while, the Daltons were on the right side of the law, three young men following their dead brother into the family trade. It did not hold, and the reasons it did not hold are murkier than any cartoon would allow. The version the family preferred, and the version Emmett would later sell in his memoirs, was that the brothers were simply never paid what they were owed. They did dangerous work, the story goes, and the government cheated them of their wages, and a man can only be robbed by his own side so many times before he stops seeing the point of honesty. There is probably some truth in that. Frontier deputies were paid by fees and mileage, and the money was often late, disputed, or simply gone. But there is another version, and it is less flattering. Bob and Grat were also accused of corruption while wearing the badge. They started working for the Osage Nation, helping organize a police force, and then were pursued for stealing horses. Bob, still a young deputy, killed a man over a woman, a rival for the affections of a girl he was courting. So whether you believe the brothers were pushed off the honest path or simply chose the easier one, the outcome was the same. By 1890, the Daltons were no longer chasing outlaws. They were becoming them. They began with horses. Rustling was quiet, profitable, and familiar to men who had spent years learning exactly how the law worked and where it did not look. When the ground in Indian Territory got too hot, 3 of the brothers, Bob, Grat, and Emmett, fled west to California, where a 4th brother, Bill, had built himself a respectable life. Bill Dalton owned a ranch, dabbled in local Democratic politics, and looked for all the world like a settled man. His outlaw brothers hid on his land. And it was in California, in February of 1891, that the Daltons attempted their first real robbery. Bob and Emmett tried to hold up a Southern Pacific train near the small town of Alila. It went badly. A fireman was shot, the money was not taken, and the brothers scattered. Grat was arrested in connection with the affair and eventually convicted, though he escaped custody before the sentence could hold him. The first Dalton robbery was, in plain terms, a failure. They should have read that failure as a warning. Instead, they read it as a beginning. Back in Indian Territory, the brothers reunited and got serious. Between the spring of 1891 and the summer of 1892, the Dalton Gang robbed a string of trains across the region. They hit the Santa Fe line, the Katy line, and others, stopping the great steam engines out on the open prairie, climbing aboard, and emptying the express car and the passengers. They were good at it now. They knew how railroads guarded their money because they had once been the men hired to guard it. Each robbery built the legend a little higher. Newspapers printed their names. Posses chased them and lost them in the caves and ravines near Tulsa. For a young man who had grown up hearing about the younger cousins, this was the life those stories had promised. And that, more than money, seems to be what drove Bob Dalton. He did not just want to be rich. He wanted to be remembered. He said as much. He wanted to do something no outlaw had ever done, something that would put the Dalton name above even the James Gang. He wanted, in his own words, to beat anything Jesse James ever did. The idea he settled on was simple to describe and almost impossible to survive. He would rob 2 banks at the same time in broad daylight in a single town. And not just any town. He chose Coffeyville, Kansas, the town where the Daltons had lived, the town where their neighbors knew their faces, the town where their brother Frank was buried. If you have been waiting for the moment where this stops being an adventure and starts being a tragedy, this is it. Before we walk into that town with them, I want to say one thing to you directly. If you are enjoying this, if you like history told straight, without the drama turned up to a scream, consider subscribing. This channel exists to find the real people underneath the legends, and there are a lot more of them to find. Now, Coffeyville. On the evening of the 4th of October, 1892, 5 men made camp on a farm a few miles outside Coffeyville. 3 of them were Dalton brothers, Bob, Grat, and the youngest Emmett, who was 21 years old. The other 2 were experienced outlaws named Bill Power and Dick Broadwell. That morning they had one plan and one enormous problem. The plan was to split into 2 teams, walk into the C.M. Condon and Company Bank and the First National Bank at the same time, take everything, and ride out before the town could react. The problem was that this was their hometown and their faces were known. To solve it, they wore disguises, fake beards, false mustaches, new clothes meant to make 5 familiar men look like strangers passing through. On the morning of the 5th of October, a little after 9 o'clock, they rode into Coffeyville and found the streets busier than they had hoped. They tied their horses in an alley across from the banks and walked toward them in 2 groups, 3 in front, 2 behind. They got only a few steps before the disguises failed. A man on the street named Alec McKenna looked closely at one of the passing figures and recognized a Dalton underneath the fake beard. He did not shout an alarm. He simply watched and moved and quietly began to spread the word. Within minutes, the truth was moving through Coffeyville faster than the robbers were. The Daltons are here. The Daltons are going for the banks. Inside the 2 banks, the robbery itself went almost according to plan. The gang got the drop on the clerks. In the Condon Bank, one of the tellers, thinking fast, told Grat Dalton a lie. He said the vault was on a time lock and could not be opened for several minutes yet. It was not true, but Grat believed him, and the gang waited, and those wasted minutes were minutes the town was using to arm itself. Because that is what Coffeyville did. This was a frontier town full of men who owned guns and knew how to use them. Word reached the hardware stores on the main street, and the stores simply handed out rifles and revolvers and boxes of ammunition to anyone willing to fight. By the time the Daltons stepped back out of the banks with their sacks of money, the plaza and the alley were no longer empty. They were full of townsmen behind wagons and door frames and window ledges, waiting. The 2 sides opened fire almost at once, and what followed was not a gunfight so much as a slaughter, and it was over in roughly 12 minutes. The gang tried to fight their way back to the alley where the horses waited. They never made it clear. The town marshal, Charles Connolly, was killed trying to stop them. 3 more residents of Coffeyville were shot down as well. Ordinary men named Lucius Baldwin, George Cubine, and Charles Brown, who had picked up rifles that morning and gone to defend their banks. But the townsmen kept coming, and the crossfire in that narrow space was murderous. Bob Dalton, the leader, the man who wanted to be remembered above Jesse James, was shot and killed near the alley. Grat Dalton, who had idolized their lawman brother Frank, died there too, not far away. Bill Power was killed. Dick Broadwell managed to reach his horse and ride a short distance out of town before he collapsed and died. Of the 5 men who had walked into Coffeyville that morning, 4 were dead in the street. Only 1 was still breathing. Emmett, the youngest, had actually reached his horse, and then, instead of riding away, he turned back into the gunfire to try to save his brother Bob, who was already dying. For that, he was shot again and again. By some counts, he took more than 20 wounds. A blast of buckshot to the back finally put him down. He should have died. The only reason he did not is grimly practical. Emmett was so obviously, so completely broken that the enraged townspeople did not bother to lynch him on the spot. There seemed no point. He was carried off to be treated more out of formality than mercy, and against every expectation, he lived. So there is your ending. The great plan to rob 2 banks at once, the scheme meant to make the Dalton name immortal, killed 8 men in about a quarter of an hour and destroyed the gang completely. Bob got his wish in a way. People did remember, just not for the reason he wanted. But this story has a strange second life, and it belongs to the 2 brothers who were not lying in that Kansas alley. The first is Bill, the respectable one, the rancher and would-be politician out in California. Bill Dalton had not taken part in the Coffeyville raid, but watching his brothers die did not turn him away from the outlaw life. It seems to have pulled him deeper in. He drifted into the orbit of the Dalton Gang, another notorious crew of the territory, and took up robbery himself. His freedom did not last long. In 1894, less than 2 years after Coffeyville, Bill Dalton was tracked down and shot dead by a posse. The last of the outlaw brothers was gone, which leaves Emmett. And Emmett Dalton is the reason this story does not simply fade out with the gunsmoke. He was tried for his part in the raid, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and was sentenced to life in the Kansas penitentiary. But he was young, and he was, by all accounts, a genuinely model prisoner. He served a little over 14 years, and in 1907, the governor of Kansas pardoned him. Emmett Dalton walked out of prison a free man, the sole survivor of the most disastrous outlaw raid in the history of the West. What he did next is almost harder to believe than the raid itself. He moved to Los Angeles. He went into the construction and real estate business and did well at it. He married. And then, as the movie industry grew up around him in that same city, Emmett Dalton did something no one could have predicted. He started selling his own past. He wrote books about his outlaw days, including one called When the Daltons Rode. He worked in early Hollywood, helping make films about the very crimes that had nearly killed him, sometimes appearing in them. The last man out of the Coffeyville alley spent his old age as an author and a minor movie figure, shaping how his own legend would be told. And we should be honest about this. Emmett's version of the Daltons is not a neutral one. He was a man with books to sell and a reputation to soften. In his telling, the brothers are more sympathetic, more wronged, more forced into crime than the harder records suggest. Some of what we think we know about the Daltons comes filtered through a man who had every reason to make them look better than they were. Emmett Dalton died in 1937 in California, an old man far from Kansas, the last living link to that morning in the alley. So how does a family like this, real, violent, tragic, become 4 identical cartoon brothers who lose to a smiling cowboy? For that, we have to leave the American frontier entirely and cross the ocean to Europe, to a Belgian artist who went by the name Morris. Morris was the creator of Lucky Luke, a comic western about a lone cowboy, the man who could draw faster than his shadow. Lucky Luke wandered a cartoon version of the Old West, and Morris loved to salt his stories with real history, real places, and real names. In 1951, in an album called Hors la Loi, which means outlaws, Morris brought the Dalton Gang into the strip, and crucially, he used the real ones: Bob, Grat, Bill, and Emmett. Morris drew them the way we now remember all Daltons, as 4 brothers who were identical in every way except height, ranked from the short and dangerous Bob up to the tallest, Emmett. And Morris did not soften their fate. At the end of that story, his Daltons die in a raid on a town, an echo of the real Coffeyville, where the true Bob and Grat had fallen. In the comic, as in life, the Dalton story ended in gunfire. That should have been the end of it. But here is the twist that created everything you recognize today. Readers loved the Daltons. These grim, doomed outlaws were, it turned out, the most popular characters Morris had ever drawn, and he had killed them off. Morris regretted it. So did Rene Goscinny, the brilliant writer who soon joined the strip and would later co-create Asterix. Goscinny had loved that original Dalton story, and between them, the two men found a way to bring the Daltons back without undoing the history they had just told. They would not resurrect the dead brothers. Instead, in the 1958 album Les Cousins Dalton, The Dalton Cousins, they introduced a second set of four brothers. Not Bob, Grat, Bill, and Emmett, but their fictional cousins, Joe, William, Jack, and Averill. These are the Daltons the world actually knows, and they are deliberately a kind of inversion of the real ones. The true Daltons were competent, ambitious, and lethal. These new cousins are bumbling and hapless, forever scheming and forever failing. They are still drawn as four identical brothers ranked by height, but now the meaning of the ranking is flipped into comedy. The shortest brother, Joe, is the meanest, a furious little man who nurses an endless hatred of Lucky Luke. The tallest, Averill, is a gentle, dim, childlike giant whose deepest ambition in life is usually his next meal. Between them stand William and Jack, the interchangeable middle brothers whose main job is to say over and over, "Calm down, Joe." Their stories became a formula, and a comforting one. The Daltons break out of jail. The Daltons hatch a plan, often pushed along by their formidable mother, Ma Dalton. The plan falls apart. Lucky Luke rounds them up one by one and marches them back to prison and rides off into the sunset. The prison dog, Rantanplan, stumbles along behind, somehow even less competent than the outlaws. It is warm, it is funny, and it is endlessly repeatable. That formula is why, for most of the world, the word Dalton means a cartoon, not a gravestone. And that is the strange distance this story asks us to sit with. Somewhere in Coffeyville, Kansas, there are real graves. Bob and Grat Dalton lie buried not far from Frank, the brother who wore the badge and died for it, the brother they once idolized before they threw away everything he stood for. 4 townspeople died that morning defending their own banks, ordinary men whose names, Connolly, Baldwin, Cubine, and Brown, are far less famous than the men who killed them. Emmett spent 14 years in a cell and then a lifetime turning his family's ruin into stories he could sell. All of that was real. All of it happened to people who breathed. And a world away, decades later, 2 European artists took that grief and that violence and, almost by accident, turned it into something children could laugh at. Not out of cruelty, out of affection. They loved the doomed outlaws so much they could not bear to leave them dead. So they gave them clumsy, immortal cousins who could never truly be hurt and could never truly win. There is something honest in that, if you look at it long enough. We do this with the Old West constantly. We take men who were frightened, greedy, grieving, and ordinary, and we sand them down into legends and then into jokes until the sharp edges are gone and all that is left is the silhouette. 4 brothers in a row, a cowboy and his shadow, a dog that cannot find its way home. The cartoon Daltons will never die because they were never quite alive. But the men underneath them were. They wanted, more than money, to be remembered. And in the end they were, just not as themselves. They live on as a shape, a gag, a fond memory from someone's childhood, while the actual mourning in the actual alley slips further out of view with every passing year. Maybe that is its own kind of ending for an outlaw. Not justice and not glory, just distance and the slow, gentle forgetting that turns a tragedy into a smile. If you want to sit with more stories like this, the real people hiding behind the legends we grew up with, that is what this whole channel is for. The next one is already on its way.